Welcome. Thank you for attending this panel, which is composed of disability rights activists and advocates. And what we'll be discussing today is creating bridges between the disability rights community and the community of accessibility researchers. On this panel, my name is Daniel Goldstein. I'll tell you more about myself in a moment, but on this panel today, first is Deborah Kaplan. She deserves to be first in, or has been first in so many respects. Deborah is currently the Deputy Director for Programmatic Access with the San Francisco Mayor's Office on Disability, where she oversees ADA compliance and complaint operations and lends expertise in disability policy issues. Before that, she had a central role at HHS in the federal government, working on implementation of technology accessibility requirements. But as many of you may guess, when she left, that task was still not completed. It could certainly use Deb's help again. At the World Institute on Disability, she was executive director for several years, and before that pioneered projects on technology policy focused on universal design and community engagement. When I first encountered Deb, she was heading the Accessibility Technology Initiative for the California State University system. The next panelist is Howard Rosenblum, and I have been privileged to know Howard for several years, and he is the Chief Executive Officer and Director of Legal Services for the National Association of the Deaf, which is the oldest national civil rights organization in the United States. He is a computer engineer and an attorney with nearly 30 years of civil rights litigation experience. Mark Riccobono is the president of the National Federation of the Blind. He is, as are all persons at the NFB, a blind person who's elected to represent other blind people. And so he plays a unique role in trying to bring the authentic perspective of blind people to the table where decisions are being made. And he has shown extraordinary success at getting in the room. His background before he was an executive at the National Federation of Blind was in business and education. So his approach to being a leader of a civil rights membership organization is built on data, business strategies, and educational principles. And then finally, Shadi Abou-Zahra, I have had the pleasure of meeting only earlier today, but I'm looking forward to getting to know him better. He is currently with the Web Accessibility Initiative of the World Wide Web Consortium and has been for some time as accessibility strategy and technology specialist. He's based in Vienna, Austria, and has had a significant role in expanding digital accessibility in Europe, including harmonizing standards and policies internationally. He has led the several European Commission-funded research and development projects on digital accessibility, and most recently led the Web Accessibility Initiative co-op project looking at research gaps in digital accessibility, which we will hear more about. So that leaves only myself to introduce. My name is Daniel Goldstein. I have had the honor to represent the National Federation of the Blind in legal matters from 1986 to the end of 2017. I am now retired or a recovering trial attorney. And I was introduced to the issue of digital accessibility in 1999 when the then president of the National Federation of Blind, Mark Maurer, said to me in conversation one day that if he were to buy a new house, he would lose much of his independence. And I looked at him puzzled, not understanding, and asked him what he meant by that. And he explained that in a new house, the thermostat would no longer have a dial, but a digital display with up and down arrows. And the same would be true for the stove, the washer, and the dryer. And he would lose his ability to do these tasks independently. To which I said something foolish like, wow, somebody ought to do something about that. And he smiled and suggested a legal campaign to get the attention of the young developers who obviously weren't having any occasion to think about disability as they designed new technology. I asked him where he wanted me to start. He suggested I sue Microsoft. Not having quite his courage, I asked if I could start a little bit smaller for a first project, and he said, fine, sue AOL. So we did, and AOL became accessible. So this suggests that we need the help of the research community to have more than tactical victories. We need to find ways to make it easy for tech developers to think about accessibility as other than an afterthought to be bolted on. Saying they need to do that is not enough. We need to show the tremendous virtues of doing so, and that requires research. We need to show the tremendous costs of not doing so. And here I'm not talking about litigation, but I believe it was 2004 when we went to Google and pointed out that Google Docs was a problem and Android was a problem. And the number of years of hard work it took to retrofit those must have amounted to an extraordinary number of engineering expenses that need never have been. And studies of that kind of cost of wasted, in a sense, or at least unnecessary engineering time is an area that would be helpful to drive home with some research. So these are just a few thoughts that I wanted to offer. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to Deb Kaplan.
Thank you very much, Daniel. It's a real pleasure to be here with such a distinguished panel, people who have already made a huge difference in the world. To participate in this conference and help to expand, hopefully, your thinking about how to continue to make a difference, and how your work can bolster the work of those of us who have been engaged in this sort of never-ending job of making sure that people don't get left out as the digital world continues to expand and infuse itself in every aspect of life. So my background is as a person with a disability, an advocate, and somebody who's very, very interested in affecting policy. When I became disabled back in the 70s, I hadn't given much of a thought to life with a disability. And then because of a injury and accident overnight, I became disabled with a mobility disability. And it was shocking to me how inaccessible the built environment was. And we've made huge strides in changing that. And in making sure that, especially as new things are constructed, there are standards to guide their construction to make sure that they're made accessible. And people now just sort of take that for granted. The same, I think it's mirrored in the digital environment. And I think one of the advantages of the digital environment is that it changes more rapidly than the built environment. And so we have even more opportunities to affect change with the next new upgrade or the next new replacement of the thing that everybody has gotten used to not being able to live without. And that's where researchers and people with disabilities can really go hand in hand.
Thank you, Deborah. And we'll hear next from Howard Rosenblum.
Hello, everyone. My name is Howard. This is my name sign, and I'm thrilled to be a part of this panel. I think it's critical to talk about these issues. The research base and the historical base that has come before us has really tried to make things better, not only for people with disabilities, but for everyone. And those strides that we have made have often unintentionally marginalized people with disabilities. And I'm happy to be here to talk through the ways that we can work together. This research needs to carry on apace. And I think we also need to turn our attention to the group who benefits from it, being people with disabilities. Personally, as I'm grateful for Dan's introduction, and I have both an engineering and legal background. And so I feel like I'm well situated to understand how technology can be a great equalizer. That being said, at the same time, it can be a barrier as well, as has been mentioned. And I would like to talk through that, my preference being with corporate, professional, private researchers and their approaches to this population. That being said, at the same time, I'm not long on patience. And when I see something that's under development that's inaccessible, I realize that that is a first step, and sometimes accessibility will be an afterthought, but I must issue fair warning. I do love to sue people. So when I see something that's going through the process of development and not accessible, I start to kind of ramp up in that way, but I really think that it's more fruitful to work together. That would be my hard preference. But there is the two ways to talk through this. It's either collaborative or litigation. You can choose the game, as it were. So I did want to mention, as has been said, that legal mandates do place a prescription on making things accessible, but there should be also a reasonable component to that. Research, science, development, etc., should be accessible to the users. There should be a way for these things to come into people's hands. And ideally, universal design would be the avenue for that, to be more inclusive, hopefully, ideally, of the community at issue. So this is something that we want to see, because you have to talk to the community of folks who have the needs and the wants for that. And you have to make sure and build that into the process. And the more accessible one thing is for another group, it might unintentionally create barriers for another group. As has been mentioned by my colleague Dan, curb cuts is one example, something that's accessible to a specific group that has ultimately been made accessible for everyone. Also, captions often are used by people who are not deaf or hard of hearing, but as Dan mentioned, can benefit hearing people in a noisy environment or on air travel. I've noticed that on my flights, a whole lot of people pop their laptops open and watch something with captions. Now, this plane isn't obviously full of deaf people, but on a plane, it's quite a noisy environment. Some people opt for headphones, and some people simply prefer to read the captions, which is all well and good. In addition to that, a lot of people have English not as their first language, and captions can really help someone to gain more proficiency in the language. That's kind of an ancillary benefit to captions. There's lots of videos that are out there being produced. And there might be, say, a specific quote in play in a movie or in a video. And you will have to ultimately find that quote, put it in the captions, and make those captions as accessible as possible. In the translation from one language to another, that would make the process all the more easy, having all of those videos accessible to everyone. There are lots of benefits across the spectrum to producing things in that way. As also we mentioned, the inaccessibility of home-based technology is one thing. And Dan was right to say that appliances and products have no legal mandate to be accessible. But if you think about it, if you want to sell them to a broader market, why not make sure that your product is the most usable to everyone? And then ultimately everyone will want to buy yours over, say, the competitors. So home-based products being accessible would only benefit a for-profit institution. So the IoT, or Internet of Things, is another thing that we can talk through. The IOAT, Internet of Accessible Things, is what I would proffer as the next version of that. All that we see now has a level of connectivity that should include the accessibility features of those respective products as well. And we need to make sure that if we can, say, communicate with the thermostat in our homes via voice, that leaves out deaf residents unable to control the thermostat in that way. If there was an iPhone, say, app that would do that, I don't know about my dishwasher, about my laundry, my laundry machines, my clothes dryer, all of the things like that, whether or not that is making the kinds of sounds that would be inaccessible to me. But I mean, we need the IoT capability to make sure that we can communicate with those things. If there is some kind of auditory signal, maybe you've left the house and you need to know that it's time to go back and grab your clothing out of the washing machine, put it in the dryer, or what have you. So it needs to be accessible to everyone. And home automation is more and more the order of the day as we are developing along those lines. But a lot of this depends on auditory input or speech input, which is ultimately not accessible to deaf people. And the group that I think have the most significant barriers are persons who are deaf and blind. And the challenges there are not only auditory, but visual as well. And so often tactile or sensory information is the best way to communicate with them. And you might have a braille reader to access the internet, or if you need to communicate with the wider world, there are other devices that might be in play. Also, in the research community, there might be a level of assumption that you would know what's best for these populations of which you are not a part, but I urge you to contact us. And after doing so, to take our advice to heart and not just follow on the course that you had already presupposed for yourself. Not kind of go off in your own way. For example, animated characters who can be lip read for children accurately, I think, is not at all something that we see. An example of dialogue that would have to happen there is you would, with an open mind, approach this population and take the recommendations from that community that you sought to include. The short way of saying that is that the National Association of the Deaf, or NAD, where I work, is always available and at the ready to hold discussions, to consult, to collaborate, to share, develop new ideas, rather than not think to include the deaf community. We think that, if you have great ideas, that's fine. Bring them to us and we will talk through them.
Thank you so much, Howard. And we're going to hear next from Mark Riccobono.
Thank you very much, Dan, and I appreciate the comments that have been made by the panelists before me. It's always a little daunting to come after folks and try to say something different, because my experience is very consistent with what's already been said. So it's really great to be part of this panel. The National Federation of the Blind, as America's civil rights membership organization of blind people, knows that blindness is not the characteristic that defines you or your future. And every day we work to raise the expectations for blind people, because we recognize that low expectations create obstacles between blind people and our dreams, that you can live the life you want, and that blindness is not what holds you back. And in my experience as a blind person, I have had to myself reformulate and understand how my own experiences, my own biases play into the way that I think about how I can participate in the world as a blind person. And I know, having dealt now with researchers for 25 years, that there are a lot of great people doing research who want to use that research to make a difference. But they're very disconnected from the people who they're doing research about or to impact. And I would just ask folks who are tuning into this panel to consider, just from my perspective, how many researchers do you know doing access in digital accessibility, digital technology, who are blind people? Let's not even say all people with disabilities right now, just blind people. Now, I can think of a couple, but comparatively, it's a small number. And so as a researcher and as someone who wants to make a difference in the field, you need to find other ways to reach out and get to know that those individuals, people with disabilities, and from my perspective, for blind people, that happens through the National Federation of the Blind. So just to share a couple of my own experiences really quickly. First of all, technology and the digital age really is represented by ones and zeros. It's not inherently visual or auditory or tactile. It's simply ones and zeros. And so we can offer technology in any or all of the forms we need to at any moment, as long as we build it to do that. And we know from the examples that have already been given that building these things from the beginning to be accessible, make them more effective, and actually help to provide innovation. Now, I grew up as a blind person, but I didn't really know I was blind because I could see a little bit, and society taught me that seeing was very important. And so I learned to fake it. When I got to the University of Wisconsin at Madison, I started to learn that faking it wasn't going to be enough, that I was actually a blind person, and I had to start to learn to operate like a blind person. But I still carried all of those same misconceptions that I grew up with. So I got hired at the university to work on converting books into accessible form for students with disabilities, including blind people. And this was a great job for me since I was a blind person and needed books. At that time, we mostly provided books on cassette. Well, cassette was starting to be an outdated medium. And so I was tasked with researching what else might be out there and what we might do. And I learned that the University of Minnesota was leading the way in converting books to an accessible format. And so I called up the university to learn what they were doing. And I talked to the individual on the phone, and I gathered all sorts of information. And then I said, well, so have you done any work to make sure that this could be accessible to blind people, the processes you're using? And the person stopped and said, well, I'm a blind person. It never occurred to me that a blind person would have been the individual behind innovating what at that time was thought to be the best process anywhere in the country for making books fully accessible. It helped me reframe my own understanding that individuals with disabilities are really the primary users in any sort of technology, should be at the center of designing and implementing that technology. So blind people were actually engineering the best practices out there for making books accessible to blind people. And that has been my experience throughout my career, whether it was finding new ways to give blind people access to science, technology, engineering, and math, whether it was helping to build technologies to identify printed information and get it to be accessible to blind people, or even engineering a car that a blind person could drive. I've always learned to rely on the authentic experience of blind people. And with those three examples I just cited, each of those was critical to having individuals who weren't blind, who were doing research and can bring their expertise. So I encourage you to think of yourself as an advocacy researcher by partnering with people with disabilities, and especially invite you to reach out to the National Federation of the Blind to know about our authentic priorities, experience as blind people, because our experience is that together we can actually innovate more accessibility than we can separately. I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you, Mark. Those were very illuminating remarks. And now we will hear from Shadi Abou-Zahra. Shadi, please go ahead.
Thank you, Daniel. It's such a great honor to be here with such a great panel of people that I know as accessibility leaders, and so it's great to be here. Yeah, so as mentioned earlier, I work for the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, at the Web Accessibility Initiative, which is continues to be directed by Judy Brewer, the director of the Web Accessibility Initiative. Now, W3C is a standardization body. It develops web standards, essentially. It was founded by Tim Berners-Lee, who is the inventor of the World Wide Web. And so at the beginning, so back in the days, actually, the web is about 30 years old, depending how you want to count. In 1991, I think Tim Berners-Lee wrote the first proposal of the World Wide Web. And it was a fairly, in today's terms, basic technology, in that it was mainly HTML, the hypertext markup language, as a document format so that scientists can share knowledge among each other. That was really the main part of it, a platform independent document format to allow researchers to share the information. So really, research is at the heart of the invention of the World Wide Web. Quite early on, people with disabilities noticed the power of the web and the potentials here to access education, employment, and everyday participation in life, be it civic participation, be it entertainment, and as we saw the web kick off and become really part of our everyday use in much of the world today, and increasingly so. So people with disabilities noticed how important the web is, and that it needs to be made accessible. And again, here, innovation from research. It was actually when I started with accessibility, I was a student at the time. The Web Accessibility Initiative had not existed. W3C had just been launched. But the Trace Center had a set of guidelines to how to make the web accessible, how to develop web pages in such a way so that they become accessible. So what I'm trying to say here really is, for W3C and for web accessibility and digital accessibility more broadly now, as the web continues to converge with other technologies, with television, with telephony, with IoT, with all these things, as they all converge and become the digital reality, participation from research is utterly important. So I want to just emphasize Deborah's words here about how important the work is that accessibility research is doing in contributing, figuring out solutions to severe challenges that we have on how to make things accessible. And the challenges are getting bigger day by day. We mentioned the aspects of IoT, of Internet of Things, how to make these all sorts of devices and sensors accessible. One of the bigger challenges even with that is that so far we've been looking at devices on their own or as specific entities, how to make a dishwasher accessible or how to make a website accessible or things like this. But now we see that things are working together. They get plugged together. You operate your lights at home or your heating system through your television or through an app, or so what I'm trying to say is, what accessibility means is changing as technology evolves. What it means to make things accessible changes as technology evolves and as we see more component-based accessibility. And the questions here are really quite severe. And there are two aspects here that we have to think of. We always think about the accessibility features, like how to make the knob on the dishwasher accessible, be it directly or be it indirectly through an app or through some other means. But that's really the solution. One thing is the how to actually get there, the authoring process. It's one thing to have a feature, but it's another thing to be able to make it easier for developers. One of the reasons why we see so many accessibility barriers on the web today, even though developers know about accessibility, increasingly know about accessibility, they just simply don't know how to do it. And the tools that they're using do not support them, do not help them to do these things. Just earlier today, when we're setting up this panel, we had this whole discussion about how to pin the windows so that the captioners are visible at all times so that people who need sign language can see them. So what I'm trying to say is, how to do something, how to get to accessibility is one thing that really needs a lot of research focus. How to get to these accessibility features, how to build it in accessibly, the term born accessible, that things are immediately as they're released be accessible. The other thing that I think we need to think about a lot is what some people call usable accessibility. Again, it's one thing to have an accessibility feature in a product. The other thing is to actually know how to use it, to be able to enable it, to be able to turn on, to know how to operate the dishwasher that has an accessibility feature somewhere, but you don't know actually how to switch it on or how to get to that, or that it even exists in the first place. And we see a lot of such things as products get more complex. And this is one of the issues with IoT. As it gets more and more complex, these technologies, also the accessibility features and the digital skills that are associated with that. So in essence, you know, do people with disabilities need to be technology experts to be able to use a device, or can accessibility be as simple as technology should be for everyone, or maybe even simpler, because we need to consider also people with cognitive and learning disabilities in the process, amongst many other disabilities. So the point I'm trying to say is there are lots of research opportunities, and we need to get it really on the ground, like how to get to accessibility, but also how to make accessibility usable. And the only way, in my view, to really get there is with co-design, with really working together with people with disabilities directly. This was been mentioned earlier, I think, as well by other panelists, but I really want to emphasize this very strongly. Without really working with people with disabilities directly, learning from each other, being part of the process, we miss out and we develop features that do not provide the accessibility that is needed, or at the end of the day are not usable really for people.
Thank you, Shadi. That was very enlightening and built so clearly on the steps that came, the people that came before you and the steps they laid out. I think at this point, it might be good to go one more round with 2 to 3 minute closing statements. And so I will begin. And am I on video? Yes, okay. And I will begin, I think, by reflecting on the good news that Deb Kaplan began with, saying that in the area of built environment, huge strides have been made. And I would like to suggest that it is because in the area of built environment, there is much affirmative guidance in the form of the accessible design standards that are quite specific and tell you what to do. It's not as clear, despite the 508 refresh, it's not quite as clear what are the affirmative steps that need to be taken. And despite, I should add, obviously, the YCAG standards and the soon-to-be 3.0, it's not always quite as clear what needs to be done, especially by the community that needs to be doing it. What do I mean by that? If you look at who creates websites today, it includes the new artisanal bakery down the street, the new bar, the gallery that's just opened. And even the basic information that tells you accessibility is should be a concern. Or that if you pick GoDaddy or Wix, and this information may be out of date, but if you pick GoDaddy or Wix, you probably won't be able to make your website accessible as you would if you'd pick Drupal or WordPress. That information is not easily gotten, much less an accessibility checker to make it easy for you to make that website accessible. So research and data on the delivery of accessibility information, again, as Shadi pointed out, with respect to our discussion about how to make this Zoom accessible. I sit on a board of a small local museum in Brattleboro and was trying to keep track of our discussion so I could convey it to our board on how to be accessible on Zoom, and then heard from Howard that it would be different if it were Teams and different if it were WebEx and so on, and realized for for the ordinary person, getting access to that information is not easy. So that is the main point I wanted to offer, was to help with affirmative steps. Let me turn now to Deb, and Deb, if you'd like to state your ask.
I'm going to make my ask to say, do something similar to what San Francisco is just about to publish. We decided we wanted to know more about the digital divide in San Francisco, especially with respect to people living in poverty, people with disabilities, and seniors. We hired a team, a very small team of people who really were grounded in both research and the community of people with disabilities. And they got over 3,000 survey responses, which is, for disability research, an astonishing return. And it yielded incredible amounts of data. To get that result, they conducted focus groups, they conducted in-depth interviews with disabled and older residents and people from disability organizations. They established over 60 partnerships with community-based organizations in San Francisco, representing all of those people. And they used a mixed methodology analysis, using a survey to get data, as well as more qualitative research. And they had an equity lens framework. And this was done over just a few months. I have to say, the whole thing is quite amazing. And it's an example of how to do that partnership that I was talking about. The results will be published in September. And I'm just going to tease a little bit with some of the key findings. For example, affordability and reliability of the internet were most commonly cited barriers among survey respondents. Having internet and devices does not mean the absence of digital needs and barriers. Technology has accelerated barriers to telemedicine, something that was experienced by over 77% of respondents reported experiencing challenges with telehealth in particular. And gaps in literacy, digital literacy skills were most commonly cited barriers amongst many of the people who were surveyed. And interestingly, one of the recommendations, especially for unhoused people, is to provide more areas where people could charge their devices, because the most commonly used device is a cell phone, a smartphone. But there are many, many other recommendations that will be coming out of this report. And I think it shows that good research can be done. The researchers worked with the community to identify the questions to ask, where to find people, how to ask the questions, and people with disabilities were very visible throughout the conduct of the entire research project. You can do that too. And perhaps not on the same scale, but I think we all really need the data. The only other thing I would say is disability data is needed, not just from disability related research. It's very, very frustrating as a policy initiator when data is collected about individuals participating in a variety of different programs and disability status is not collected. So we don't know the impact on people with disabilities. So I think I would like to add that it's incredibly important to be collecting disability data when you're collecting broad demographic data, whatever the research you're doing.
Yes, hello. For my ask, I would pose a few things. The first of which being, Be careful of those who say that they're experts on all types of disabilities. Most people have a niche, a certain specialization in a given area. And when we have consultants on the Americans with Disabilities Act, often people claim to understand the gamut of disability, but in reality, things happen on a case-by-case basis. Certainly deaf people are an example of that. So take great care, such as Deborah indicated, to get the right information from the right informants from the right communities. The second ask I would have, which would be when you suggest a given solution, make sure there is redundancy, different ways that one can interact with a given solution. That might be one voice option and a text option, or even a tactile option. So make sure that there are different ways to interact with the product. That way you can capture the future of what the lifespan of that technology will be. Also, it can be a challenge because technology changes and evolves. And if you set a particular standard in place, it might be a barrier to innovation going forward. So as new innovations emerge, as they do, make sure that all of the various disability communities will be captured in that. Thank you. That concludes my remarks.
Thank you so much, Howard. Mark?
So really quickly, from the perspective of the National Federation of the Blind, I'd offer these thoughts. First of all, if you want to do research around people with disabilities, center people with disabilities in that research. Disability is the only characteristic that any of us could acquire at any time in life. So don't try to anticipate what people with disabilities need, but center people with disabilities in that. Also, the second point is to view people with disabilities and organizations like the National Federation of the Blind as not just a resource for understanding the community, but a real resource for getting the word out. So we have a research advisory council in the National Federation of the Blind. We vet projects to make sure they're consistent with the priorities of blind people, and we help spread the word about those priorities and the research being done by folks that we partner with, because so often people say, well, we can't get people to participate in our research. So we help make those connections, but we prioritize projects that are aligned with our philosophy and approach to empowering blind people in the community. So we can partner with you on that. The last point I would make in the last ask is no matter what research you're doing, regardless of whether you think it touches people with disabilities or not, if you're doing technology research, be the ally in the room who's asking, what is the impact of this research on people with disabilities? How are we incorporating people with disabilities into this work? We were recently working with a tech company, and they said they were doing a lot of great work around blind people, and we asked about the blind people they were working with, and universally they were all blind people who were not Braille readers. And to Howard's point, that means they were leaving out a huge swath of blind people, also deaf blind individuals, and that's because nobody was asking that question. If you're in that room and there's nobody with a disability, be the one who's asking, how are we ensuring that this research project incorporates feedback of people with disabilities? Every project should do that, not just those that are focused on empowering people with disabilities. Thank you, and reach out to the National Federation of the Blind anytime.
Thank you, Mark. Shadi, you're going to have the last word.
Thank you. And it's very difficult to add more to what the speakers before me said, because I completely agree and support these thoughts. One additional ask maybe is look at also how coordinated your research is with other research that has happened before, with the actual need of people with disabilities, also the actual need on an applied level. And here, one of the opportunities that I welcome you to work with is, mentioned earlier, was the Way Co-op project, Communities of Practice project, which is having actually an online symposium next month in November, trying to look at what are accessibility challenges and opportunities in digital accessibility. And we invite you to participate to this. The Way Co-op project, one of our partners in here is the European Disability Forum, which is the umbrella organization of people with disabilities across all of Europe. Consists of many other organizations as their members, including different types of disability organization. So if you are looking at accessibility research in Europe, this is definitely a central organization to go to. And what we're trying to look at here is bring together disability organization, bring together research from academia and from industry, and try to kind of bring together what are really pressing questions that both industrial research and academic research want to look at, but also that people with disabilities think are important, so we can help prioritize work in this area. So here's another avenue, another place you can coordinate with, and I really welcome you to participate in this panel and learn about what you're working on.